The Salem Witch Trials of 1692 were not just an isolated event, but the culmination of deep-seated fears and societal tensions that had been simmering for years. This was a time shaped by an intense belief in the supernatural, where stories of witches could easily cause hysteria. It was rooted deeply in their worldview, where evil forces weren't abstract. They were tangible threats.
Right. And when I think about this, it's like the difference between a bad rumor at work and, well, accusing someone of literally working with the devil. The stakes were huge and terrifying, honestly.
Exactly. The Puritans of New England were rigidly religious. They believed in a world ruled by God, but also deeply threatened by Satan. To them, witches were a real and imminent danger, capable of inflicting harm on the community in ways that couldn't be countered by ordinary means. It was a battle of good versus evil, and they felt they were on the front lines.
But wait, how did they even define a witch? Like, what made them go, yeah, this person's definitely in league with Satan?
Ah, that's a good question. It often came down to suspicion more than proof. If someone didn't conform to the community's expectations, maybe a healer with unconventional methods, or even just a neighbor who seemed different, they could quickly become a target. Sometimes accusations came from personal vendettas. Other times, it was just mass paranoia. And then there's the tragedy.
Oh, so you're saying this wasn't even about specific evidence? It was kind of like anyone who stood out just became a threat?
Precisely. The harrowing part is how these fears played out in such a tight-knit community. Salem was small, deeply insular. Imagine living in constant suspicion of your neighbors, wondering who might accuse you next, or if you had unknowingly done something to draw their ire.
I can't even imagine. It's like you had to keep your head down and just hope you didn't attract attention. And honestly, that sounds exhausting.
It was, Eric, and these trials didn't emerge out of nowhere. Years of economic instability, battles with indigenous peoples, and even rivalries within the community itself created an environment ripe for fear to fester. It's important to understand all of that context to truly grasp how such a tragedy could unfold.
And it's wild how quickly those beliefs spiraled into action, like actual trials where people were sentenced and convicted.
They believed they were defending their community, their faith, their entire way of life. But the process was arbitrary and deeply flawed, relying on so-called spectral evidence, or the visible hallucinations of the afflicted, which couldn't be cross-examined or verified in any meaningful way.
So basically, I saw them in a dream and that's proof? That's terrifying.
It was a profound miscarriage of justice, and it shows us how dangerous it is when fear and superstition overrule reason and fairness. The trials claimed the lives of so many, 19 executed, hundreds jailed. It was a catastrophe rooted in unchecked panic.
And it all comes back to leadership, doesn't it? Who was making these calls?
That's a great question, Eric. Leadership played a huge role, and to understand Salem's hysteria, we have to focus on the individuals driving it. One of the most significant figures was Reverend Samuel Parris. He didn't just guide the community spiritually. Parris was deeply invested in rooting out supposed witches. His fiery sermons and growing paranoia acted as fuel to the fire, escalating tensions in Salem
Wait,
Village.
so you're saying the guy leading the church was also like fanning the flames for all this?
Essentially, yes. He framed the trials as a fight against the forces of evil, which aligned conveniently with his own struggles to maintain power in a divided community. And then, we can't overlook the judges like Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. They presided over these trials, and they didn't exactly question the legitimacy of what was happening. If anything, they perpetuated it.
Were they even trying to, I don't know, look for like real evidence? Or were they just rubber stamping every accusation that came through?
Evidence, as we think of it today? Hardly. The accused often faced spectral evidence, which was completely unverifiable. The afflicted girls would claim to see spirits or experience attacks in dreams. And rather than dismissing this as hysteria or fabrication, judges like Hathorne and Corwin leaned into it. They believed it was proof enough.
Their whole legal process sounds insane. I mean, if someone can literally make up an invisible demon attack, and that's enough to convict someone, that's terrifying.
Terrifying and deeply tragic, especially when we consider the victims, many of whom were women like Sarah Osborne, accused simply for being different or for stepping outside societal norms. Sarah Good was another. She was homeless and outspoken, which in that rigid society made her suspicious. And then there was Tit Uba, the enslaved woman whose confession under duress fanned the flames even higher.
Oh, wow. So Tiruba's confession wasn't even voluntary? She just told them what they wanted to hear?
Exactly. Being both enslaved and an outsider, she was an easy scapegoat, and her confession, a mix of coerced details and what the interrogators wanted to hear, added legitimacy to all of it in the eyes of the community. She described vivid tales of witchcraft and consorting with the devil, which only inflamed the panic.
Man, it really feels like everyone rational got drowned out. Like there wasn't anyone who tried to just, you know, put on the brakes.
There were dissenting voices, but they were drowned in the sheer tide of hysteria. It wasn't until later that figures like Increase Mather spoke out against the reliance on spectral evidence. But by then, the damage was done. The community had already been torn apart, families destroyed.
And all this was set against what? This bubbling undercurrent of fear and paranoia.
You're absolutely right, Eric. Fear and paranoia weren't just personal anxieties, they were amplified by the harsh realities of life in Salem. For instance, the unforgiving New England winters weren't just a seasonal inconvenience, they were a constant source of discomfort, exacerbating scarcity and illness. This kind of relentless pressure can shape the psyche of a community, making external threats feel even more immediate and
So
overwhelming.
you're saying it wasn't just fear of, like, witches, but fear of everything around them?
Precisely. The Puritans faced not only the harsh elements, but also frequent skirmishes with indigenous neighbors, whose land they were encroaching upon. And then there's the political instability. Salem had its own squabbles over boundaries and leadership. All of this created a pressure cooker environment. Fear of witches became a way to channel all these anxieties into a single external threat.
Wow. And instead of dealing with, well, all that actual stress, they just looked for scapegoats. It makes sense, but it's tragic when you think about it.
Tragic and deeply human. That fear wasn't just contained within the masses, though. It seeped into leadership, too. The judges, the ministers, even community elders, they believed they were protecting their way of life. Reverend Samuel Parris, who we mentioned earlier, truly thought he was doing God's work by rooting out evil. But those beliefs were warped by fear, and fear distorts judgment on an alarming scale.
Wait, so they weren't just malicious. They really believed this was their duty?
Yes, Eric. For many leaders, they were the defenders of the moral order, the ones standing against chaos. It was almost a crusade in their minds. But here's the danger: when leaders act from fear, rather than critical thinking or compassion, they risk justifying the worst atrocities as necessary.
Huh. And that's what led to these mass accusations. These leaders leaning on fear instead of, let's be real, their common sense.
Exactly, it became a vicious cycle. Leadership's fears amplified the public's anxieties, and the public's panic pushed leadership to act even more rashly. It's a powerful example of how environmental and psychological stress can erode reason and ethics in a community.
And it probably didn't help that they lived in such close quarters, isolated like that. It's like paranoia had nowhere to go but explode.
Absolutely. Small insular communities can become breeding grounds for distrust and suspicion. And when leadership fails to diffuse those tensions, or worse, inflames them, the results can be catastrophic. That cycle of fear and rash decisions we just discussed during the Salem Witch Trials has parallels that resonate even today. It underscores the vital role of critical thinking, of questioning assumptions, no matter how deeply entrenched or widely accepted they may seem.
Right? Because it's so easy to just, go along with the majority, especially when emotions are running high. I mean, groupthink can be a real slippery slope.
Exactly, Eric, and groupthink thrives when we let fear dictate our decisions. It encourages a kind of intellectual laziness, where people stop asking tough questions because the certainty of the crowd feels safer than the discomfort of doubt.
And that fear, man, it always feels so justified in the moment, doesn't it? Like, this is the thing we gotta fight, no questions asked.
It does. And that's why it's so important, so vital for individuals, especially leaders, to model and encourage a deeper level of inquiry. We need to ask, what else could explain this situation? Or, why are we reacting so strongly? Skepticism, when applied constructively, is a shield against mass hysteria.
But how do you even build that kind of habit? I mean, most people aren't out there practicing constructive skepticism.
It starts with education, teaching people to value evidence over anecdotes, to look for diverse perspectives, and to challenge their own biases. And here's the thing, this isn't just about individuals. Communities and institutions need these safeguards too. Checks and balances, diverse opinions, and transparent processes play a huge role in preventing the kind of blind conformity we saw in Salem.
I like that, thinking about it as a community effort, not just something you're, left to figure out on your own. It's kind of reassuring, honestly.
It is. But it's also a responsibility. We often don't realize how much power we hold as individuals within our groups by refusing to buy into fear-driven narratives and being courageous enough to stand up for fairness. Each of us can disrupt that cycle of blind panic and mistrust.
Yeah, it's like you don't have to be a leader with a capital L to make a difference. Even just saying, hey, does this really make sense? Can, shift the whole tone of a situation.
Absolutely, Eric. The Salem Witch Trials are a stark reminder of how dangerous unchecked fear can be, but they also show us a path forward. Through vigilance, reflection, and compassion, we can prevent that kind of tragedy from repeating itself.
And on that note, this has been such an eye opening conversation. Thanks for diving into all of this, Cheryl.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you to everyone listening. Let's continue to learn from history and strive to do better. Until next time.